The chamber was enormous, and Commander Jake Morrison felt small standing in its center. Above him floated the representatives of 12 alien civilizations, and each one looked down at him with something between disgust and fury. The walls of Orbital Prime's Judicial Hall curved upward in a perfect circle, and the ceiling showed the stars beyond through transparent metal that shouldn't exist by Earth's understanding of physics. But then again, humanity was new here and there. Were many things they didn't understand about the galaxy yet. Morrison stood with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that every military officer in human history would recognize. His uniform was crisp and dark, blue with silver insignia that marked him as a commander in the Earth Defense Force. Next to him stood Lieutenant Amy Stevens, wearing the same uniform but with the additional badge of the Legal Corps pinned above her heart. She carried a data tablet that glowed softly in her hands, and her expression was calm, despite the hostile atmosphere pressing down on them. Both, the Archon Thress spoke first, and its voice came through the translation device as something between a hiss and a clicking sound that made Morrison's teeth ache. The Archon was insectoid with a body that looked like it was carved from black glass, and eyes that reflected light in colors humans had no names for. It had been alive for 300 years, and had presided over the Galactic Council's judicial matters for the last century. Nothing in its long experience had prepared it for dealing with humans. Commander Morrison of the species known as humanity, the Archon said, and its mandibles clicked together in a way that the translator interpreted as disapproval. You stand accused of 17 violations of the Galactic Combat Accords during the recent conflict in the Outer Rim territories. How do you answer these charges? Morrison didn't answer immediately. He looked up at each of the council members in turn and let the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. It was a tactic he'd learned from interrogation training back on Earth, and it worked just as well on aliens as it did on humans. Let them wait and let them wonder what you're thinking. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was neither apologetic nor defiant. I acknowledge that human forces employed tactics not described in the Galactic Combat Accords, he said carefully. Whether those tactics constitute violations is a matter of interpretation. The chamber erupted in sounds that the translator struggled to process. Outrage came through clearly enough, though. A reptilian delegate from the Score Dominion rose from its seat, and its scales flushed from green to angry red. Interpretation? It demanded. You used deception in battle. You attacked without formal challenge. You struck at supply lines instead of engaging our warriors directly. You dishonored every principle that civilized species have followed for 10,000 years. Lieutenant Stevens stepped forward slightly, and her voice cut through the noise with surprising authority. The Galactic Combat Accords were established 4,000 years before humanity even invented writing, she said. We were never consulted in their creation, and we never agreed to be bound by their terms. Earth is not a signatory to any galactic treaty regarding warfare. The Accords are not a treaty, another voice called out. This one belonged to a being that looked almost like a living cloud of luminous gas contained within a force field. They are the natural law of civilized combat. Every species that reaches the stars independently discovers these truths. To fight any other way is to embrace barbarism and chaos. Morrison watched Stevens handle the objection with practiced ease. She was young for her rank, but she'd been the top graduate from the legal academy, and she'd volunteered for this assignment when everyone else said it was career suicide. Natural law implies universality, Stevens said. Yet humanity evolved entirely separate from galactic civilization, and our approach to warfare developed along completely different lines. Perhaps what you call natural law is simply what you're accustomed to. The Archon raised one of its blade-like forelimbs, and the chamber fell silent. We will examine the evidence before we engage in philosophical debate, it announced. Present the charges. A holographic display materialized in the center of the room, and Morrison found himself watching footage from the war. The images were captured from Kavalak's Empire military vessels, and they showed human ships moving in patterns that clearly confused the alien commanders. Traditional galactic warfare was almost ritualistic in its precision. Fleets arranged themselves in formations that had been refined over millennia, and battles were fought like chess matches where both players could see every piece on the board. The humans didn't play chess, though. They played poker, and they cheated. The footage showed a human destroyer group broadcasting a distress signal and moving as if their engines were damaged. A Kavalak's battlecruiser moved in to deliver the killing blow as protocol demanded. Then 3 more human ships appeared from behind a nearby asteroid field, where they'd been hiding with their systems powered down. The Cavalix cruiser was destroyed in seconds, and the damaged human destroyer suddenly accelerated away at full speed, showing that it had never been crippled at all. Deception. In combat, the prosecutor announced. It was a small furry creature that looked almost cute by human standards, until you noticed the calculating intelligence in its eyes. The combat accords clearly state that military vessels must broadcast their true status and capabilities. This allows for honorable engagement between forces. More footage played, and each clip showed another example of humanity's unconventional approach. Human ships used debris fields and radiation zones as cover, even though the accord specified that combat should occur in clear space. Human commanders launched attacks during the sleep cycles of species whose biology required regular rest, even though the accords required formal notice before any engagement. Human forces targeted fuel depots and supply convoys instead of seeking glorious fleet battles. The worst offense, according to the Council, was shown last. A Cavalix admiral had broadcast a formal surrender after losing half his fleet in an engagement. The accords required that Morrison accept the surrender immediately and allow the defeated forces to withdraw with honor. Instead, Morrison had ignored the surrender for 6 hours while his forces continued to destroy supply ships and mining facilities in the system. Only when the Cavalix had nothing left to sustain their fleet did Morrison accept their surrender. You denied an honorable enemy their right to withdraw from combat, the Archon said, and its voice carried genuine anger now. You forced them to watch as you destroyed infrastructure that, by rights of conquest, should have been preserved for the victor. You treated them not as worthy opponents, but as prey to be hunted. Morrison met the Archon's inhuman gaze without flinching. I treated them as an enemy that would resupply and return to kill more of my people if I gave them the chance, he said simply. The war didn't end because they surrendered one battle. It ended because I made sure they couldn't fight another one. The chamber fell into a heavy silence, and Morrison could feel the weight of 12 civilizations' judgment pressing down on him. These beings had fought wars for longer than humanity had existed as a species, and they all agreed on one thing. Humans fought like monsters. Captain Ben Hayes remembered the first battle clearly, even though part of him wished he could forget it. The Aurora had been humanity's pride back then, with weapon systems that matched anything the galaxy could field, and armor plating that could withstand direct hits from plasma cannons. None of that had mattered when the Cavalix Empire's fleet arrived in formation above the disputed colony world of New Horizon. The Cavalix had followed every rule perfectly. They'd transmitted their declaration of war exactly 72 hours before engaging as the combat accords required. They'd provided a list of their grievances in 17 languages, including English. They'd even offered humanity the choice of battlefield location, as was customary when the defending party held less territory. Hayes had thought it was all very civilized right up until the moment his ship started dying. The human fleet had arranged itself in what the tactical computers suggested was the standard defensive formation. 12 destroyers in front with the heavier cruisers behind, and the carrier Aurora at the center where it could launch fighter craft. It was a formation that made perfect sense if you were playing by galactic rules. The Cavalix approached in their own traditional formation, and the two fleets met in the empty space between planets like knights in some ancient tournament. Hayes had watched from the Aurora's bridge as the first exchange of fire lit up the darkness. Human weapons were good, but the Cavalix had been fighting wars for 3,000 years, and they knew exactly how to respond to every move the humans made. When human destroyers tried to flank, the Cavalix formation shifted to counter. When human fighters launched, the Cavalix deployed their own in a pattern designed to create a killing field. Within an hour, 4 human ships were debris and the rest were retreating. That night, Hayes had sat in the officers' mess with his tactical officer Lisa Grant, and neither of them had touched their food. "We can't win fighting like this," Grant had said quietly in her high. Andia shook slightly as she held her coffee cup. "They've been perfecting these formations since before we invented gunpowder. Every move we make, they've seen it 1,000 times before." Hayes had agreed, but what choice did they have? Earth Command had ordered them to follow the combat accords because they hoped it would lead to a negotiated peace. The thinking was that if humans proved they could fight like civilized beings, the galaxy would accept them as equals. Instead, they were just proving they could die like civilized beings. The second battle went even worse. The Kvaliks adapted to the few surprises humanity had managed in the first engagement. And this time, they didn't just defeat the human fleet, but humiliated it. They destroyed ships with surgical precision and left the crew pods intact as the Accords required. It was mercy, but it felt like mockery. Hayes lost 2 more destroyers and the Aurora took damage that required 3 days in space dock to repair. Admiral Peter Cole arrived on the Aurora during those repairs, and Hayes had never seen the old man look so tired. Cole had commanded Earth's defense forces for 15 years, and he'd built the fleet from almost nothing into something that could stand against alien technology. Now he was watching it get torn apart by enemies who fought with one hand tied behind their backs and still won easily. "We're fighting their war," Cole said to the assembled officers in the Aurora's briefing room. "We're using their rules and their tactics and their entire framework for how combat should work. And we're losing because of it." Someone had objected and pointed out that violating the combat accords would turn the entire galaxy against Earth. Cole had nodded slowly. "Maybe," he'd admitted, "but following them is going to get us all killed. I'd rather be alive and hated than dead and honored." What happened next changed everything. Cole brought in historians and strategists from Earth who'd never served in the military, but who understood warfare in ways the career officers didn't. They pulled up ancient battles from human history and showed footage that made the alien observers uncomfortable. The Trojan horse and how the Greeks had won through deception. The Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal had surrounded and destroyed a Roman army twice his size. The guerrilla campaigns that had defeated empires throughout human history. Every species in the galaxy evolved as the apex predator on their world, one of the historians explained. Her name was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and she specialized in comparative military history. They got to the top of their food chain and stayed there. They developed technology and society without serious competition. Their warfare evolved into something almost ceremonial because they never needed it to be anything else. She pulled up images of Earth's prehistoric past showing multiple human species competing for the same resources. "We didn't have that luxury," Mitchell continued. "Homo sapiens survived because we were meaner and smarter than every other human species. Then we turned on each other and spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing our own kind. We didn't develop rules for warfare because we had honor. We developed them because we needed to stop ourselves from committing genocide every few generations." Admiral Cole had made his decision then. Earth would stop fighting by galactic rules and start fighting to win. He'd expected resistance from his officers, but Hayes had surprised himself by being the first to agree. The Kvaliks had killed too many of his friends, and he was tired of losing people to maintain some alien sense of propriety. The change in tactics was immediate and brutal. Human ships stopped broadcasting their positions and started hiding in places the combat accords said were off limits. They powered down systems to appear as debris, then activated and struck when enemy ships passed. They studied Kvalik psychology and learned that the insectoid species had rigid hierarchies that made certain decisions predictable. When the Kvalik's fleet arranged itself in ceremonial attack formation, human ships were already positioned. To hit them from angles their formation couldn't defend. Hayes led one of the most effective strikes himself, when he took 3 destroyers into a nebula that the Kvaliks considered too dangerous for combat operations. The enemy fleet was refueling at a depot they thought was safely behind their lines. Hayes waited until their defensive screens were down for maintenance and then struck without warning or declaration. The depot was destroyed in minutes and the Kvaliks fleet was left stranded without fuel. The aliens screamed about honor and civilization, but their ships still burned just as bright. Human forces began using psychological warfare and broadcasting false communications to confuse enemy commanders. They launched attacks during alien sleep cycles and struck at targets the Kvaliks had assumed were too unimportant to defend. They fought like humans had always fought when survival was on the line and suddenly the war started. Turning, Grant had found Hayes, after one particularly successful ambush, and she'd looked troubled despite their victory. "The other species are watching," she'd said. "They're seeing how we fight and they're terrified. Even our allies are starting to question whether they want humans as friends." Hayes had understood her concern, but he'd also understood something else. "They're not terrified because we're monsters," he'd said. "They're terrified because we're effective. For 10,000 years they've fought wars like chess games where everyone knows the rules. We just showed them what happens when someone plays a different game entirely. That was 3 months ago, And now Commander Morrison was standing trial for winning the war in the only way humanity knew how. Hayes watched the tribunal proceedings from Earth, and he wondered if the galaxy would ever understand. Humans hadn't broken their rules out of cruelty or barbarism. They'd broken them because following those rules meant extinction, and humanity had learned long ago that survival mattered more than honor. Lieutenant Amy Stevens stood before the Galactic Council with her data tablet held firmly in both hands, and her voice carried across the chamber with more confidence than she actually felt. The evidence against humanity was damning, if you accepted the premise that the combat accords applied to Earth in the first place. Her entire defense rested on challenging that premise, and she knew it was a gamble that could backfire spectacularly. The prosecution has presented 17 violations of the combat accords. Stevens began, and her words were measured and precise. But there's a fundamental question that must be answered before we can determine if these were actual violations. Did humanity ever agree to follow these rules? The Archon Thresh shifted in its elevated position, and its mandibles clicked in what the translator interpreted as irritation. The combat accords are not an agreement between parties, it said coldly. They represent universal principles that any civilized species recognizes upon reaching the stars. Your species built faster than light drives and energy weapons. That alone proves you possess the intelligence to understand these principles. Stevens had expected this argument, and she'd prepared for it carefully. Intelligence doesn't equal agreement, she countered. Humanity understands the principles outlined in the Accords. We simply reject them as inadequate for the type of warfare we've experienced throughout our history. Understanding something and accepting it as binding are two entirely different things. A murmur ran through the council chamber, and Stevens could see several delegates conferring with their advisors. She pressed her advantage before they could formulate a unified response. "I'd like to call my first witness," she announced. Professor Daniel Wright, specialist in xenoanthropology and comparative civilization studies. The holographic display shifted to show a middle-aged human male with graying hair and tired eyes. Wright had spent the last 10 years studying every alien species humanity had encountered, and his findings had made him deeply unpopular with most of the galactic community. He didn't particularly care about being liked, though, and that made him the perfect witness. "Professor Wright," Stevens began, "you've studied the evolutionary history of all 12 species represented on this council. Can you describe the common patterns you found?" Wright nodded, and his image manipulated data displays that appeared in the air around him. "Every species here evolved as an uncontested apex predator on their homeworld," he explained in the patient tone of someone who'd given this lecture many times before. The Kavaliks had no natural predators after their first million years of evolution. The Score Dominion's ancestors eliminated all competing species before developing tool use. The pattern repeats across all council species. They reached the top of their respective food chains and stayed there. The reptilian Score delegate hissed in annoyance. "What does our evolutionary history have to do with combat doctrine?" it demanded. Wright smiled thinly. "Everything," he said. "Species that evolved without serious competition develop warfare differently than those that faced constant existential threats. Your combat accords emphasize direct confrontation and formal structure, because you never needed to fight any other way. You were always the strongest thing on your planet, so you could afford to fight with honor and ceremony." The professor pulled up images of Earth, and the council members who had never seen humanity's homeworld before leaned forward with interest. The planet looked deceptively peaceful from orbit with its blue oceans and white clouds. Wright zoomed in to show prehistoric landscapes where multiple human species coexisted and competed. Earth hosted at least 6 different human species at various points. Wright continued. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others were still discovering. We weren't the strongest or the fastest. We survived because we were the most adaptable and the most willing to use unconventional tactics. When a Neanderthal was stronger, we used tools. When prey was scarce, we stole from other groups. We learned early that survival mattered more than fighting fair. Morrison watched from his position on the chamber floor as the council members absorbed this information. He could see the discomfort in their body language and the way they shifted in their seats. Wright was forcing them to confront something they'd never considered before, which was that their way of warfare wasn't universal, but rather a product of their specific evolutionary circumstances. Stevens let the silence stretch for a moment before asking her next question. "What happened after Homo sapiens became the only human species left?" Wright's expression grew darker. "We turned on ourselves," he said bluntly. "For 10,000 years we fought each other with increasing sophistication. We developed agriculture, which led to property disputes. We built cities, which led to siege warfare. We invented gunpowder and aviation and nuclear weapons. Every technological advancement was weaponized within a generation. Earth's history is written in blood and warfare and the constant struggle for survival against enemies who were just as intelligent and creative as we were." The chamber had gone completely silent now, and even the translator devices seemed subdued. Wright pulled up statistics that showed the scale of human conflict throughout history, wars that killed millions and technologies designed for no purpose other than more efficient killing. It was a brutal picture, and Morrison knew it wasn't going to win them any sympathy from the council. "Your point, Professor Wright?" the Archon asked, and its voice was carefully neutral. "My point is that the combat accords emerged from species who never needed to fight intelligently," Wright said, and his words carried an edge now. "You fight with rules because you never faced an opponent clever enough to exploit those rules. Humanity spent millennia fighting enemies who would use any advantage they could find. We didn't develop honor codes for warfare out of nobility. We developed them to prevent ourselves from destroying our own species. And even then, we broke them constantly when survival demanded it." Stevens thanked Wright and dismissed his testimony before the council could mount an organized counterargument. She needed to maintain momentum, and her next move was the most critical. "I'd like to call Commander Morrison to the stand," she announced. Morrison walked to the center of the chamber and stood where everyone could see him clearly. He looked small and fragile compared to most of the alien delegates, but there was something in his posture that suggested he didn't feel disadvantaged. Stevens had coached him on this testimony for weeks, and they both knew it could determine the outcome of the entire tribunal. "Commander Morrison," Stevens began formally, "the Council has heard testimony about humanity's evolutionary history and our approach to warfare. Can you explain the tactical decisions that led to the charges against you?" Morrison took his time answering, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and almost conversational. "The Kavalix Empire declared war on Earth over mining rights to a colony we'd established legally under galactic law," he said. "They followed every protocol in the combat accords when they did it. They gave us notice and they chose an honorable battlefield, and they expected us to meet them in traditional formation." He paused and looked up at the council members. "We tried that in the first 2 battles," Morrison continued. "We lost a third of our fleet and hundreds of good people died following rules we didn't understand. So I made a decision. We would stop fighting the war the galaxy expected and start fighting the war we knew how to win." The score delegate leaned forward aggressively. "You mean you decided to abandon honor and fight like savages?" it said accusingly. Morrison's expression didn't change. "I mean, I decided to keep my people alive," he replied simply. "The Kavalix were better at fighting by your rules because they'd been doing it for thousands of years. We'd been doing it for 3 weeks. So we changed the rules to ones we'd been practicing since we lived in caves." Stevens pulled up footage that Morrison had personally selected, and it showed human military history in rapid succession. Ancient armies using terrain to defeat larger forces and naval commanders using weather and deception to sink enemy fleets. Resistance fighters sabotaging supply lines and asymmetric warfare that brought down empires. Every clip showed humans winning through intelligence rather than brute force. "This is what we are," Morrison said, and his voice carried throughout the chamber. "We're not monsters or savages. We're survivors. Every tactic you've accused us of violating has a parallel in our history that saved lives and won wars. When you say we fought without honor, what we hear is that we fought intelligently. When you say we used deception, we hear that we used our brains instead of just our weapons." The Archon raised a blade-like forelimb for silence. "Do you feel no shame for your tactics, Commander?" it asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity, rather than just accusation. Morrison met the Archon's inhuman gaze without hesitation, and for the first time since the tribunal began, he smiled slightly. "I feel the same shame you would feel for using your advanced technology against a species that only had primitive weapons," he said quietly. "Which is to say none at all. You mistake our tactics for dishonor. We see them as the tools that kept our people alive and won the war. If that makes us criminals in your eyes, then I suppose we're guilty. But I'd rather be a living criminal than an honorable corpse." The tribunal chamber felt different on the 4th day, and Morrison noticed the change immediately. Some of the council members wouldn't meet his eyes while others stared at him with what looked like reassessment, rather than hostility. The testimony from the previous session had planted seeds of doubt, and Morrison could see them taking root in ways both helpful and dangerous. Lieutenant Stevens stood ready with her data tablet, but before she could call the next witness, a junior delegate from the Torvin Collective requested permission to speak. The Torvins were a relatively young species by galactic standards, and they'd only joined the Council 200 years ago. Their representative was a being that looked almost like a crystalline formation that pulsed with internal light when it communicated. "I have studied the human military records provided to this tribunal," the Torvin delegate said, and its voice came through the translator with a musical quality. "There is something I do not understand. The humans possessed weapons they did not use. Chemical agents that could have sterilized planets and biological weapons that could have eliminated the Gavalics entirely. Why were these not deployed if human warfare is truly without limits?" Stevens seized on the question immediately because it was exactly where she'd wanted to steer the conversation. "Permission to present evidence," she requested, and the Archon granted it with a gesture of one blade-like forelimb. The holographic display activated and showed classified footage that Morrison had kept sealed until now. The first clip showed a human strike team approaching a Gavalic's military installation that intelligence had identified as a weapons depot. The team had authorization to destroy it with high-yield explosives, but when they breached the facility, they found it was also storing food supplies for a nearby civilian population center. Morrison's voice came through on the recording, and he was clearly frustrated. "Abort the demolition charges," he ordered. "Intelligence was wrong. This isn't just a military target. Mark the coordinates and we'll come back with precision strikes that can separate the weapons from the food storage." More footage played, showing similar decisions made throughout the war. Human medics treating wounded Gavalic soldiers, even though the combat accords didn't require it. Human commanders choosing slower and more difficult tactical approaches to avoid damaging infrastructure that civilian populations depended on. Morrison himself refusing to authorize a weapons system that would have shortened the war by weeks, but at tremendous cost to non-combatants. The council chamber had gone quiet, and Morrison could see confusion on many faces. This wasn't the picture of ruthless barbarians that the prosecution had painted. Stevens let the footage speak for itself for several minutes before she addressed the council directly. "Humanity didn't ignore the combat accords because we're savages," Stevens said firmly. "We ignored them because they're inadequate. They govern fleet formations and formal challenges, but they say nothing about protecting civilians. They require honor between warriors, but they don't address the ethics of total war. We fought by our own rules, and our rules were actually stricter in the ways that mattered most." The Archon was silent for a long moment, and its insectoid features were impossible to read. Finally, it spoke in a tone that carried something Morrison couldn't quite identify. "The tribunal will recess for 6 hours, it announced. "The council requires time to deliberate on what we have seen." Morrison and Stevens returned to their assigned quarters on Orbital Prime, and neither spoke until the door sealed behind them. Stevens let out a breath she'd been holding and sat heavily in one of the chairs. "That went better than expected," she admitted. "But I'm not sure it's enough." Morrison poured himself water from the dispenser and stared out the viewport at the stars beyond. "They're scared," he said quietly. "We proved that their entire system for managing warfare is built on assumptions that don't hold when you introduce a species like us. Even if we win this tribunal, that fear isn't going anywhere." What Morrison didn't know was that at that exact moment, Archon Thress was requesting a private meeting with him. The message came through official channels an hour later, and Morrison found himself being escorted to a small meditation chamber deep within the station. The Archon waited there alone without guards or observers. "This conversation is not part of the official proceedings," the Archon said without preamble. "What I tell you now is truth that the council cannot speak openly." Morrison nodded slowly and waited for the ancient being to continue. The Archon moved to the chamber's viewport, and its reflection in the transparent metal looked like something from a nightmare. "The tribunal was never truly about justice, Commander Morrison," it admitted. "It was about fear." The words hung in the air between them, and Morrison felt his stomach tighten. "Explain," he said simply. "For 10,000 years, the Galactic Council has maintained peace through mutual agreement," the Archon continued. "We fight limited wars with agreed rules because the alternative is annihilation. Every species here possesses weapons that could sterilize worlds, but we don't use them because everyone follows the same constraints. The combat accords aren't just tradition. They're the foundation of galactic stability. Morrison began to understand. And humanity threatens that foundation, he said. Your species is chaos given form, the Archon replied, and there was no anger in its voice now, only weariness. You fight wars where the only rule is victory. You innovate and adapt and refuse to be bound by convention. If other species learn from your example, the entire system collapses. Wars will become unpredictable again. The peace we've maintained for millennia could shatter. Morrison met the alien's compound eyes. So this tribunal is really about making an example of us, he said. Punish humanity and hope it scares everyone else back into line. It was, the Archon corrected. But the evidence your lieutenant presented has complicated matters. Several council members are now questioning whether the combat accords are truly adequate. The younger species especially seem intrigued by human methods. There are already quiet discussions happening about trade agreements and defensive pacts with Earth. The revelation was both encouraging and troubling. Morrison considered his next words carefully. What are you asking me, Archon? He said. I'm asking if there's a way forward that doesn't end with either humanity's punishment or the collapse of galactic order. The Archon replied. Your species cannot unlearn what it knows about warfare. But perhaps there's a compromise that satisfies both our needs. Morrison thought about the proposal he'd been developing with Stevens for weeks. It was risky and he'd planned to save it for the final session, but maybe this private moment was the right time to plant the seed. What if humanity established its own combat protocols? He suggested. Rules based on our experience and philosophy. We wouldn't follow your accords, but we'd have structure and limits. Other species could choose which framework they want to operate under. The Archon was silent for so long that Morrison wondered if he'd miscalculated. Finally, the ancient being turned from the viewport, and its mandibles clicked in a pattern the translator interpreted as consideration. That might work, it said slowly. It preserves the concept of rules while acknowledging that those rules need not be universal. The council might accept it as a face-saving compromise. Back in their quarters, Specialist Karen Wells was doing what intelligence officers did best, which was finding information that people wanted hidden. She'd been quietly monitoring communications throughout Orbital Prime, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. The Kvalix Empire had deliberately provoked the war with humanity, and they'd done it with the Council's quiet blessing. The entire conflict had been a test to see how dangerous humans really were. If humanity had followed the combat accords and lost, they would have been dismissed as primitives who got lucky with technology. If they'd won while following the rules, they'd have been accepted as civilized. Instead, they'd done the worst possible thing. From the Council's perspective, which was, win by changing the rules entirely. Wells brought her findings to Morrison immediately, and he read through the intercepted communications with growing anger. They set us up, he said quietly. Hundreds of people died because the Council wanted to test whether we were dangerous. Stevens looked at the data and her tactical mind was already working. This changes everything, she said. If we reveal this during the tribunal, it puts the Council on trial instead of us. They'll have to either admit they engineered a war to test a new species, or they'll have to drop the charges to avoid the scandal. Morrison considered the option, but something held him back. If we expose this, we make permanent enemies of the entire Council, he pointed out. We win the tribunal, but lose any chance of real integration into galactic society. Is that the victory we want? The three humans sat in silence, considering their options, and outside their window, the stars of a galaxy that didn't quite know what to do with humanity burned in the eternal darkness. Somewhere on Earth, millions of people waited to learn if their species would be welcomed among the stars or cast out as criminals. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on Morrison's shoulders. We hold this information in reserve, he decided finally. We present our own solution first. If the Council rejects it and tries to punish us anyway, then we reveal what they did and let them deal with the consequences. Stevens and Wells both nodded in agreement, and Morrison felt the pieces of his strategy falling into place. Tomorrow he would present humanity's answer to the combat accords, and the galaxy would have to decide whether it could adapt to accommodate a species that refused to fight by anyone's rules but their own. The final session of the tribunal began with an atmosphere of expectation that Morrison could feel like electricity in the air. The council members had spent the recess period debating among themselves, and he could see the divisions forming along predictable lines. The older species like the Kavaliks and the Score wanted punishment, while the younger members seemed more uncertain about the path forward. Morrison stood in the center of the chamber with Lieutenant Stevens beside him, and this time he carried something the council hadn't seen before. It was a physical document printed on actual paper, because humans still believed that some things were too important to exist only as digital data. The pages were bound in dark blue leather, and the cover bore a simple title in silver letters that read, Terran Combat. Protocols. The Archon Thress called the session to order, and its mandibles clicked in the formal pattern that indicated official proceedings. Commander Morrison, it began, the Council has reviewed all evidence presented in this tribunal. Before we render judgment, do you wish to make a final statement? Morrison stepped forward and held up the bound document so everyone could see it. I do, Archon, he said clearly. The Council has accused humanity of violating the Galactic Combat Accords. We've explained why we didn't follow rules we never agreed to, and why our approach to warfare developed differently from yours. But explanations aren't enough. The galaxy needs to know that humanity doesn't fight without any rules at all. We just fight by different ones. He opened the document, and the holographic displays throughout the chamber activated to show its contents in text that every species could read in their own language. These are the Terran combat protocols, Morrison continued. We wrote them during the war with the Kavaliks. They represent humanity's philosophy on warfare, based on 10,000 years of hard experience. Stevens activated detailed displays that showed sections of the protocols, and Morrison walked the Council through them methodically. Section 1 addresses legitimate military targets, he explained. We recognize that in modern warfare, economic and infrastructure targets can be valid objectives, but we absolutely prohibit deliberate attacks on purely civilian populations. No bombing of residential areas and no weapons designed primarily to kill non-combatants, the Score delegate hissed skeptically. Your own tactics included striking supply depots that served civilian populations, it pointed out. Read Section 1, Paragraph 4, Morrison replied calmly. It specifically allows targeting dual-use infrastructure, but requires commanders to minimize civilian casualties and provide warning when possible. I followed that rule during the war. When we hit that depot, we first evacuated the nearby civilian center and only struck after confirming they'd reached safety. He moved to the next section before anyone could object further. Section 2 covers the treatment of prisoners and wounded, Morrison said. The Galactic Combat Accords require acceptance of surrender, but they don't specify what happens after. Our protocols mandate medical care for wounded enemies, humane treatment of prisoners, and protection of those who've surrendered from further harm. We don't just accept surrender. We protect those who offer it. Stevens pulled up the footage they'd shown previously of human medics treating Kvalik's wounded, and Morrison let it play for a moment. We fought hard, but we weren't cruel, he said simply. That distinction matters to us even if it doesn't to you. The protocols continued through sections on deception and warfare, asymmetric tactics, and the use of advanced weapon systems. Each section was carefully worded to permit the flexibility that human warfare required, while maintaining ethical boundaries that humanity considered non-negotiable. Morrison could see council members reading ahead on their own displays, and he watched their reactions carefully. Section 7 is perhaps the most important, Morrison said, and his voice grew harder now. It addresses warfare against opponents who don't follow any rules. The Galactic Combat Accords assume all parties agree to fight honorably. Our protocols recognize that some enemies won't. They provide frameworks for resistance against occupation, for fighting opponents who target civilians deliberately, and for responding to genocide. The chamber fell silent at that last word, and Morrison pressed forward. Your combat accords are beautiful documents for wars between civilized opponents who respect each other, he said. But they're useless against an enemy who wants to exterminate you. Humanity learned that lesson in our own history multiple times. We had to develop rules for the wars you hope never happen. The Archon leaned forward, and its compound eyes reflected the light in ways that made them seem to glow. Are you suggesting the Galactic Combat Accords are insufficient? It asked. I'm saying they're incomplete, Morrison replied. They work for the wars you've fought for 10,000 years. They don't work for the wars we've fought or the wars we might all face someday. Our protocols aren't meant to replace yours. They're meant to be an alternative framework that species can choose if the traditional accords don't fit their needs. Stevens stepped forward now, and her voice carried throughout the chamber. Earth proposes a new understanding of galactic warfare, she announced. Multiple frameworks can coexist. Species who prefer the traditional combat accords can continue following them. Species who want more flexibility can adopt the Terran protocols. When forces from different frameworks meet in battle, they negotiate which rules apply before the first shot is fired. The council erupted into immediate debate, and Morrison heard translation devices struggling to keep up with a dozen different species all talking at once. Some delegates were outraged at the suggestion that the ancient accords weren't universal. Others seemed intrigued by the idea of choice. The younger species especially appeared interested in having options beyond the rigid traditional structure. The Archon called for order, and silence gradually returned. "This is unprecedented," it said, and Morrison couldn't tell if that was admiration or condemnation. "You're suggesting that combat rules should be negotiable rather than absolute." Morrison met the Archon's gaze, and now he allowed himself to smile slightly. It wasn't a cruel expression, but it was confident in a way that made several council members shift uncomfortably. "I'm suggesting that combat rules are already negotiable," he said. "The difference is that now everyone knows it. For 10,000 years you've maintained the illusion that your way is the only civilized way. We've proven that's not true. Other species will learn from our example whether you punish us or not. You can either accept that reality and work with it, or you can fight a losing battle to maintain a system that we've already shown has cracks." The truth of his words hung in the air, and Morrison could see several delegates recognizing it. Humanity hadn't just won a war against the Kvalix Empire. They'd won an ideological victory by proving that alternative approaches to warfare could be effective. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned, and the galaxy couldn't pretend anymore that the combat accords were natural law rather than cultural convention. A small delegate from a species Morrison didn't recognize stood and requested permission to speak. "I have reviewed the Terran protocols in detail," it said in a voice that was surprisingly deep for its size. "They are harsh and permit tactics my people would consider dishonorable, but they are also more comprehensive than our accords in protecting non-combatants and preventing total war. I find myself troubled by agreeing with humans, but I cannot deny the logic of their approach." More delegates spoke, and the debate stretched on for hours. Morrison stood at attention through all of it and let them argue while the seeds he'd planted took root. Some council members would never accept human methods, but others were already seeing the advantages. The galaxy was changing, and no tribunal verdict could stop it. Finally, as the station's artificial day cycle approached evening, the Archon called for a final vote. "The council must decide," it announced. "Do we find humanity guilty of violating the combat accords and impose sanctions? Or do we accept their alternative framework and allow multiple approaches to warfare to coexist?" The vote was closer than Morrison had expected. 7 species voted for conviction while 5 voted for acceptance. The Archon itself abstained, which under council rules meant the motion failed to achieve the required majority. No verdict would be issued, and humanity would face no official punishment. Morrison let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Stevens gripped his arm briefly in congratulations before remembering they were still being watched by the entire galaxy. The tribunal was over, and while it wasn't a complete victory, it was enough. The Archon addressed Morrison directly one final time. "Commander Morrison of Earth," it said formally, "this council cannot reach consensus on your guilt or innocence. Therefore, the charges are dismissed without prejudice. However, let it be known that the galaxy is watching your species. The Terran protocols will be studied and debated. Other species may choose to adopt them or may develop their own alternatives. You have changed warfare for all of us, and we will be dealing with the consequences of that change for generations to come." Morrison inclined his head respectfully. "The galaxy can watch all it wants, Archon," he replied. "Humanity will continue to fight the way we've always fought, which is to survive and protect our own. If that makes us different from other species, then we'll be different. But we won't be victims, and we won't follow rules that get our people killed just to make others comfortable." The tribunal dissolved, and Morrison and Stevens made their way back to their ship. Behind them, the council chamber erupted in arguments that would probably continue for months. Some species would lobby to reinstate the charges, while others would begin drafting their own alternative combat frameworks. The galaxy's approach to warfare would never be the same, and humanity had been the catalyst for that change. On the observation deck of their ship, as it prepared to leave Orbital Prime, Stevens joined Morrison with 2 drinks from the mess hall. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the massive station recede in the viewport. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Stevens asked quietly. Morrison considered the question seriously. "I think we did the only thing we could," he replied. "The galaxy wanted us to fight by their rules or be punished for refusing. We showed them a third option, which is making our own rules that work for us. Now everyone else has to decide if they're brave enough to do the same." Across the galaxy, on dozens of worlds, military academies began quietly requesting copies of the Terran protocols. Young officers from species that had fought by the same rules for thousands of years started studying human military history. The changes would be slow and many species would resist them, but the seeds of transformation had been planted. They argued Earth violated combat rules, until a human smiled and said, "That's why we made our own." And the galaxy would never be the same.